So, in the late 19th century, there was this British archaeologist traveling through Greece, and he noticed something like incredibly strange.
Oh, the Milkstones, right?
Exactly, the milkstones. Local women in these rural villages were wearing these small, beautifully engraved stones around their necks. And they called them milkstones. They wore them as amulets to help with nursing, supposedly.
But he noticed something else about them, didn't he?
Right. He looked closer and he saw these intricate, completely undeciphered hieroglyphics carved into the stones. And he basically traced those amulets across the water all the way back to the island of Crete.
Wow.
Yeah. And when he finally started digging there, he didn't just find, a few old statues. He unearthed a massive 5-story high, sprawling Bronze Age palace. I mean, he discovered an advanced civilization with indoor plumbing and vibrant art that, honestly, history had just entirely forgotten about.
That's just the perfect entry point for what we're doing today. You're listening to Mindful Moments, Nourish Your Mind on the Go, which is a channel devoted to turning great books into critical thinking practice you can carry with you.
And today, we are embarking on a really in-depth exploration of a truly monumental work of history. We're taking a deep dive into Will Durant's The Life of Greece.
Which is the second volume of his massive series, The Story of Civilization.
Right. And our mission in this deep dive is not to just, recite a dry list of ancient dates or catalog dead kings.
Yeah.
We want to really record and contemplate the origin, the growth, maturity, and, the ultimate decline of Greek civilization.
And we're doing this because almost everything secular in our modern culture has its direct roots in ancient Hellas. I mean, for you listening right now, when you look at the political concept of democracy or, the civic machinery of paying taxes.
Taxes.
Or the perennial conflict between religion and science, the emancipation of women, or even ecological disasters.
Like the clear-cutting of forests and soil erosion.
Exactly. All of these issues violently agitated the brilliant and turbulent life of ancient Greece.
Reading Will Durant's history feels remarkably like looking into a cultural mirror. We are studying ancient Greece to really understand our own civilization's strengths, our hidden vulnerabilities, and perhaps even our potential expiration dates.
It's sobering. But to understand how this dynamic society emerged, we really have to look at the physical stage they played on. Because in the history of Greece, geography is destiny.
Oh, absolutely. The Mediterranean Sea is basically the ultimate supporting character here.
Yeah, we look at a map today and we often think of oceans as massive barriers, right? Like keeping people apart. But for the ancient world, the Mediterranean was a superhighway.
Because of the islands, right. I mean, the Aegean Sea is just absolutely peppered with them.
Exactly. Those islands were scattered across the water like stepping stones. So a mariner sailing these waters was never more than 40 miles from land.
Which is huge for early sailors.
It's crucial because it allowed early navigation long before anyone had invented the magnetic compass. And, there was a central current that flowed continuously from the Black Sea right into the Aegean.
And the winds, too?
Yeah, the northeasterly Etesian winds. They blew with absolute predictability every single summer. So these reliable movements of wind and water allowed early sailors to develop the actual science of navigation.
Transforming these dangerous water routes into, cheap, efficient avenues for international trade.
Right. And that maritime trade brought immense wealth. And that wealth first concentrated on the island of Crete, which brings us right back to our British archaeologist and the Milkstones.
Arthur Evans.
Yes, Arthur Evans. What Evans unearthed at Crete around the year 1900, it fundamentally shifted our entire understanding of human history.
It really did.
He purchased a site that another archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, had previously identified. And within just 9 weeks of digging, Evans and his team exhumed the massive palace of Minos at Knossos.
Which is wild because prior to this discovery, classical scholars basically just assumed Greek history began much later.
Yeah, they thought it started maybe with the Dorian invasion or the first Olympic Games. But Evans revealed this highly advanced pre-Greek Bronze Age civilization that was thriving over 1,500 years before the birth of Christ.
Minoans.
The Minoans, exactly.
And the details of Minoan society are, they're shockingly modern. They built multi-story houses, sometimes reaching 5 stories high.
5 stories in the Bronze Age.
Right, and they were interconnected by these grand staircases, Plus, they had sophisticated indoor plumbing.
That's the part that always gets me.
I know. We are talking about terracotta pipes designed with carefully tapered ends so that the water pressure would naturally build up and flush out sediment.
That is a level of civil engineering you just do not expect from society living 3.5 millennia ago.
Not at all. And they produced pottery so delicate and thin, it's literally referred to as eggshell ware.
And their daily life and their fashion were incredibly distinctive, too. I mean, they exhibited this borderline pathological obsession with tiny waists.
Oh, the corsets.
Yeah, both men and women wore incredibly stiff, tightly laced corsets to achieve this really specific, triangularly slim figure.
It's so fascinating looking at the frescoes on their palace walls. You see men with dark, ruddy skin wearing simple loincloths, while the women wore these elaborate, brightly colored, flounced bell skirts.
And bodices that were completely open at the chest, exposing their bare breasts.
Right, and we really have to talk about the social structure those frescoes imply, because the status of women in Minoan Crete was exceptionally high.
It was almost a matriarchal society, which is a massive contrast to the severely restricted lives of women in later classical Greece.
Exactly. I mean, Minoan women worked in the fields alongside men. They attended public theater. They drove chariots.
They drove chariots.
Yeah. And they dominated the religious pantheon. Their supreme deity was a powerful mother goddess. She's frequently depicted holding live snakes in her hands, which, symbolized her direct dominion over the earth and the mysteries of the underworld.
It's such a rich culture.
But wait, here's my question. If they were so civilized and so luxurious and so advanced, how did they collapse so completely that they were literally reduced to forgotten millstones?
Well,
Because, people often paint Minoan Crete as this peaceful, idyllic utopia since their cities didn't have massive defensive walls. But to me, that sounds incredibly naive.
it does.
To put it in modern terms, Minoan Crete sounds like a highly advanced, luxurious, but ultimately fragile tech hub. They focus entirely on innovation, beautiful art, and comfortable plumbing, but they forgot to build firewalls against the scrappier, hungrier startups on the mainland.
They assumed the sea was their wall.
Right.
But the sea was their wall only as long as they controlled the ships. And the immense wealth of Crete eventually attracted the violent envy of the mainlanders.
Of course it did.
So, around the 15th century, before our era, a catastrophe struck. The archaeological record shows fire and widespread destruction. The palaces of Knossos were destroyed, and the fall of Crete left this massive power vacuum across the entire Aegean network.
And that vacuum was immediately filled by the people who had been basically quietly copying the Minoans' homework for centuries.
The Mycenaeans and the Achaeans.
Right. Which brings us to another legendary and frankly chaotic archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann.
Oh, Schliemann. He was a wealthy German merchant who read Homer's Iliad not as poetry, but as literal factual history.
Which everyone thought was crazy.
Completely crazy. Conventional wisdom dictated that the Trojan War was just a myth. But Schliemann disagreed, so he used his personal fortune to conduct these reckless, highly destructive, but ultimately world-changing excavations.
He dug at Mycenae on the Greek mainland, and he dug at the site of Troy in modern-day Turkey.
And against all odds, he found them both.
Even though his methods were like a total nightmare by modern standards, I mean, he used dynamite.
Yeah, dynamite.
He blasted through layers of actual Troy just to get to what he thought was the bottom.
He destroyed so much history trying to find history.
He really did. But the artifacts he pulled out of the earth were staggering. At Mycenae, he uncovered massive cyclopean walls.
And we call them cyclopean because they were built with stones so impossibly large that later Greeks looked at them and genuinely believed they must have been constructed by a mythical race of giant cyclops.
Exactly. And he discovered the royal shaft graves, pulling out incredible amounts of gold jewelry, bronze daggers intricately inlaid with silver, and of course that stunning golden death mask.
The Mask of Agamemnon.
Right. Schliemann famously looked at it and claimed he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, the mythical king who led the Greeks against Troy.
Now, he was wrong about the dates. The mask actually predates the hypothetical Trojan War by centuries.
Oh, sure.
But he's right about the reality of the civilization itself. And the society of these mainlanders was drastically different from the refined elegance of the Minoans.
Very different.
The Achaean warriors of the heroic age were rougher, physically imposing, and intensely focused on martial prowess. So while Homer's poetry paints this era as, a dream of fair women and noble men, the daily reality of their lives was brutal, violent, and incredibly dangerous.
And we see a major cultural pivot in how they handled death, too.
Yeah, the burial practices.
Because the Mycenaeans buried their dead in these elaborate beehive-shaped tombs, which suggests a very specific, grounded view of the afterlife and a deep connection to a physical location. But the Achaeans shifted entirely to cremating their dead.
And that shift to cremation is a profound cultural marker.
How so?
Well, it almost always indicates a nomadic background. If your people are constantly moving, fighting, and migrating, the careful tending of physical ancestral graves becomes impossible.
That makes total sense.
Right. You burn the dead so you can carry their essence or free their spirit while you remain on the march. The Achaeans were this rugged Greek-speaking people who migrated down into the Peloponnesus, forcefully subjugated the local populations, and basically grafted their own martial culture onto the remnants of Minoan art and administration.
And that violent synthesis created the civilization we see reflected in Homer's epic poems.
Exactly.
But even Achaean dominance had an expiration date. Around the year 1100 before our era, two major things happen. First, the discovery of iron weapons. And second, a massive new wave of invaders pushing down from the north known as the Dorians.
The Dorian invasion.
Yeah, and this combination completely shattered the Mycenaean world. Greece plunged into a brutal dark age. Agriculture was deeply disrupted, international maritime trade collapsed entirely, and the vibrant naturalistic art of the Minoans just vanished.
It was replaced by a rigid, lifeless, purely geometrical style of pottery.
The Dorian invasion sounds like a massive server crash that wiped out centuries of cultural data.
That's a really good way to put it.
The surviving Greeks were forced to scatter across the Aegean Sea, fleeing their burning cities, settling on random islands and foreign coasts just to survive. They were like lost backup files trying to reboot a civilization.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, was Homer's poetry basically just a nostalgic coping mechanism? Like, were these epics created for a displaced society living in the literal ruins of a greater past, desperately trying to remember who they used to be?
They absolutely served that psychological function. The epics provided a unified, shared mythological past for a deeply fractured and traumatized people.
Yeah.
But Will Durant points out something essential here.
It's that.
This period of violence, displacement, and chaos was actually the necessary crucible for classical Greece.
Really? The Dark Age was necessary?
Yeah, because the violent mixing of Cretan, Mycenaean, Achaean, and Dorian bloodlines, alongside the forced collision of their diverse ideas, languages, and political institutions, that is exactly what created the unparalleled, restless flexibility of the classical Greek mind.
Okay, I see. So out of that Dark Age chaos, these displaced Greeks fled across the sea and inadvertently planted the seeds of Western philosophy and science in foreign soil.
Exactly. They engaged in a massive migration, establishing colonies along the coasts of Asia Minor, southern Italy, Sicily, and northern Africa.
And it is so vital for you listening to remember that Greece was never a single unified country. It wasn't like a modern nation state.
Not at
Oh, it was a sprawling, decentralized network of independent city-states, fiercely competitive and often at war with one another. They were united by only three things, really. Their shared language, the Olympic Games, and a shared pantheon of gods.
Right, and to really understand how diverse these city-states were, we have to look at the two absolute superpowers of the time, Sparta and Athens.
They could not have been more different.
No, polar opposites. Sparta is, well, it's the legacy corporation in our historical business model. They were heavily militarized, deeply conservative, and completely terrified of innovation.
And their entire system was dictated by brutal demographic reality, wasn't it?
Yes. The Spartan citizens were vastly outnumbered by the Helots.
The enslaved population.
Right. The Helots were forced to work the agricultural land to feed the Spartan military machine. And because they were so outnumbered, the Spartans lived in constant paranoid fear of a Helot uprising.
So they instituted a totalitarian state.
Completely. They sacrificed all art, all philosophy, and all individual liberty just to maintain absolute collective discipline. I mean, they even utilized a secret police force, the Cryptia, to terrorize the Helots and assassinate any slave who showed leadership potential.
That's incredibly bleak.
It is.
Athens, on the other hand, was the brilliant but chaotic tech startup. It was unstable, wildly innovative, deeply unequal, but it was slowly, painfully inching toward democracy.
And the pivotal moment in that evolution was the intervention of Solon.
Right, because Athens was on the brink of a bloody, catastrophic class war because of widespread debt slavery.
The Hectomoroi.
Yeah, Poor farmers were literally selling themselves and their own children into slavery just to pay off exorbitant debts to wealthy landowners.
The tension was explosive. The poor demanded a complete redistribution of all land, and the rich demanded the strict enforcement of all debts.
But then, in a rare moment of collective rationality, the Athenians granted dictatorial powers to a statesman named Solon to fix the crisis.
And Solon executed a brilliant middle-path economic reform. He simply canceled all existing agricultural debts and outlawed debt slavery forever.
Which, honestly, how did he survive doing that? You wipe out the ledgers of the ultra-wealthy, you usually end up assassinated.
Right. He survived because he refused to redistribute the land itself. So the wealthy were furious about losing the debts owed to them, but they kept their physical estates.
And the poor were disappointed they didn't get free land, but they regained their freedom and their children.
Exactly. By angering both extremes just enough, Solon avoided a civil war and laid the necessary economic groundwork for citizenry of free men who could eventually participate in government.
That is such a delicate balancing act.
It really is. Now, while Athens was reforming its domestic politics, the intellectual revolution of the ancient world ignited far away from the mainland.
Right. It started in the Ionian colonies on the coast of modern-day Turkey, in cities like Miletus.
And you have to ask, why did philosophy and science start out in the colonies instead of the historical center?
It's entirely economic and geographic, isn't it?
Mostly, yes. The Ionian colonies controlled the robust maritime trade routes connecting the east and west. This generated immense wealth, and wealth buys leisure time. You cannot invent philosophy if you are working 14 hours a day in a rocky field just to survive.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, their location at the crossroads of the Mediterranean meant merchants were constantly bringing in Egyptian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, and foreign religious ideas.
And this daily exposure to diverse, contradictory cultures steadily eroded the strict, traditional religious dogmas of the Greek colonists. Think of the Ionian colonies as, like, teenagers moving out of their parents' house. They leave the strict, conservative religious traditions of the mainland behind.
That's a great analogy.
And without the priests and the old aristocracy breathing down their necks, they were completely free to invent a radically secular, rational way of looking at the universe.
Right. Instead of asking what the gods wanted, thinkers like Thales and Anaximander started asking what the physical world was actually made of.
And this rational inquiry marks the dawn of the Ionian Enlightenment.
It does. But this fractured network of experimenting city-states soon faced an existential threat that would define their history.
The relentless expansion of the Persian Empire?
Yes, the massive Persian military machine attempted to conquer mainland Greece.
And the fact that the Greeks survived that threat is frankly one of the great upsets in military history. I mean, the improbable Athenian victories over the Persians at Marathon and later the naval victory at Salamis.
It gave Athens a massive, unprecedented surge of political and cultural confidence.
And that sheer confidence launched the Athenian Golden Age.
Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens reached the absolute zenith of its imperial and cultural power. The wealth flowing into Athens from its newly formed empire funded a cultural explosion that still defines our concept of classical antiquity.
And the actual mechanics of their democracy were so raw, visceral, and incredibly intense.
Oh, it was wild.
They didn't have representatives voting for them in quiet chambers. They gathered in a massive outdoor assembly, sometimes thousands of men at once, to directly debate and vote on state policy.
And to keep anyone from monopolizing the floor, they used clepsydras, or water clocks.
Right. Picture two large terracotta pots. The top pot has a precise hole in the bottom. You fill it with water, and the water slowly drains into the bottom pot.
And when the top pot is empty, your speaking time is up, and your mic is effectively cut.
It was a raucous, terrifying environment of direct citizen participation. Like, any eligible man could speak, but only if he could mentally withstand the screaming, whistling, and jeering of the crowd.
Pericles utilized the wealth of the Athenian Empire to initiate massive public works, too, most famously the construction of the Parthenon on the Acropolis.
Which is still iconic today.
Yeah, and this era also witnessed the birth of classic drama in the theater of Dionysus. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides invented tragedy as we know it, weaving poetry, music, and dance together to explore profound moral, religious, and political questions in front of the entire citizenry.
And simultaneously, figures like Hippocrates were dragging medicine away from religious superstition, magical amulets, and divine curses.
Steering it toward empirical observation and ethical standards, codified in the Hippocratic Oath.
But here is where we really have to stop and critically evaluate what is actually happening.
Right.
Because when you look closely at this society, you run headfirst into a massive, glaring contradiction. How do we reconcile the undeniable intellectual brilliance of Athenian democracy with the stark reality that the entire system was utterly dependent on a massive, brutalized slave class?
It's the elephant in the room.
It really is. The men sitting in the assembly debating the pure concepts of freedom and justice were only able to be there because enslaved people were working the silver mines and the farms.
It is the defining tragic flaw of the Athenian model. The leisure required for their democratic participation, their philosophizing, and their artistic creation was directly extracted from the forced labor of others. You cannot build the Parthenon or sit in the theater all day if someone else isn't producing your food and mining your silver.
And it wasn't just the reliance on slavery, it was the complete systemic subjugation of women.
Yes.
Married women essentially vanished from the historical record during this so-called enlightened era. They were confined to the back rooms of their houses, forbidden from the assembly, forbidden from the theater, completely uneducated, and treated as legal minors for their entire lives.
The very dark side to the Golden Age.
Honestly, if we evaluate their democracy critically, Athens was basically a massive, oppressive country club.
A country club.
Yeah. A few elite men sat around talking beautifully about liberty, while enslaved people and women did the brutal physical labor necessary to keep the city running.
It's a harsh assessment, but it is entirely historically accurate.
Yeah.
The Greek democratic ideal was strictly, ruthlessly limited to a very narrow definition of who counted as a citizen.
Yeah.
But alongside this deep social contradiction, there was a profound, growing intellectual conflict. The fatal battle between philosophy and civic religion.
Let's dig into that tension, because the Golden Age looks beautiful from the outside, but internally it was tearing itself apart.
Exactly. The secular skeptical philosophy that started in Ionia finally made its way to Athens.
Right.
You had the sophists, who taught that all truth is subjective and morality is just a social construct.
Right.
And you had materialist thinkers like Democritus, who argued the universe is just atoms and void, with no gods in sight.
Yeah.
This relentless intellectual skepticism actively eroded the traditional religious beliefs of the average Athenian.
But, in the ancient world, you cannot separate church and state. The religious beliefs were the literal glue that held the state together.
Precisely the problem.
The civic religion provided the moral foundation for the laws. If the gods don't exist, why should anyone obey the laws of the city?
And when the philosophers questioned the gods, they inadvertently threatened the foundational stability of the state itself. The political establishment recognized this threat.
And that leads to Socrates, right?
Right. The trial and subsequent execution of Socrates is the violent culmination of this exact conflict. Socrates relentlessly questioned every assumption of Athenian life.
And the state, feeling deeply vulnerable after years of war, lashed out at the intellect that was undermining its traditional foundations.
They forced him to drink hemlock, not because they hated philosophy, but because they believed his skepticism was destroying the youth and unraveling the social fabric of Athens.
So, how does a culture at the absolute undeniable peak of human intellectual and artistic achievement manage to completely destroy itself in just a few generations?
Well, this brings us to the suicide of Greece.
The primary agent of this destruction was the Peloponnesian War, wasn't it?
Yes. This was a brutal, protracted, 27-year conflict between the Athenian naval empire and the Spartan land alliance.
It wasn't just a war. It was a prolonged national suicide that entirely exhausted the soil, bankrupted the treasuries, and completely broke the spirit of the Greek world.
And Will Durant presents a core thesis regarding this collapse that we really need to unpack.
Okay, what is it?
Durant argues that civilizations rise when three things are perfectly aligned: the energy of the people, a shared unifying belief system, and robust political institutions.
Okay.
Conversely, civilizations decay when wealth becomes heavily concentrated in the hands of a few, when interpersonal trust between citizens erodes, when public duty is abandoned in favor of private, selfish gain, and when extreme individualism completely breaks down social cohesion.
So in the context of the Peloponnesian War,
Durant notes that Athens possessed incredible intellectual and political freedom, but it entirely lacked internal moral discipline. Sparta possessed rigid, unyielding discipline, but it completely lacked freedom and the capacity to adapt.
And they just ground each other into
Oh,
dust.
exactly.
It's like our tech startup going to total war with the massive legacy corporation. The startup has all the brilliant ideas, but they're internally chaotic and arrogant. The legacy corp has relentless grinding discipline, but no vision, and they just fight until both companies are utterly bankrupt and ripe for a hostile takeover.
That is a perfect analogy.
But I want to push back on Durant's conclusion regarding the role of the intellectuals. Like, is Durant genuinely implying that too much intellectual freedom and too much scientific skepticism actually destroys the foundational myths a society desperately needs to survive? Because if so, that's a terrifying thought for any modern democracy.
Well, Durant's narrative absolutely leans in that direction. He observes that as traditional religious belief decayed under the assault of rational philosophy, the moral glue of the polis weakened.
Right.
When citizens no longer believed the gods were watching, they prioritized their own wealth over the survival of the city. And this directly contributed to the political decline of Athens. However, as modern readers, we must apply a critical lens to Durant's perspective here.
Because he wrote this in 1939, right?
Yes, exactly. His prose is beautifully written, and his synthesis is masterful, but it strongly reflects the limitations of its time. Modern classicists warn that Durant's history is heavily, almost exclusively, focused on elite male actors.
The generals, the philosophers, the wealthy statesmen.
Right. Newer historical scholarship provides a much more inclusive and accurate view of the economic engine of antiquity. We must look at the marginalized people, the women managing the household economies, the enslaved people in the mines, the foreign merchants.
The people who actually kept Greece running while the philosophers debated the nature of the soul.
Exactly. Relying solely on the actions of the elites gives a distorted view of why the entire system eventually collapsed.
That's a really vital distinction. The history of the elite class is only a fraction of the full story. We are basically reporting on his thesis here, but it's important to remember it's just one, elite-focused interpretation.
Precisely.
But despite this catastrophic internal collapse, the story of Greece doesn't end with the smoldering ruins of the Peloponnesian War.
No, it doesn't.
Greece ultimately lost its political freedom. It was conquered by King Philip of Macedonia and his son. But in losing its political independence, Greek culture kind of burst its geographical borders and ended up conquering the very empires that defeated it.
And this transition leads us into the Hellenistic Age, which was violently catalyzed by the conquests of Alexander the Great.
Alexander.
Yes. Alexander wasn't merely a military conqueror obsessed with territory. He acted as the agent of historical necessity. He effectively ended the insular era of the independent Greek city-states and forced a new cosmopolitan globalism upon the entire Mediterranean and Near East.
He built cities and established trade routes that spread Greek culture, Greek language, and Greek civic institutions all the way to the borders of India.
Right. And the center of gravity for Western civilization shifted completely away from the shadow of the Parthenon in Athens to massive, wealthy new cities like Alexandria in Egypt.
So the Hellenistic Age was fundamentally different from the Golden Age.
Completely different. It was an era of vast, state-funded libraries and intense, specialized academic scholarship. It represents the absolute climax of ancient Greek science, producing monumental figures like Euclid.
Who systematized geometry.
Right, and Archimedes, who revolutionized physics and engineering.
But culturally, something vital had been lost, hadn't it?
It had. It was an era where the raw, original creative genius of the Periclean age gave way to artificial, highly technical academic criticism.
Like, poets were no longer writing for the entire citizenry in the open-air theater. They started writing complex, obscure verses exclusively to impress other cloistered poets in the library.
Yes, exactly. And the psychological impact of this new globalism was devastating to the average person.
I can imagine.
With the independent, tight-knit city-state dead, the old civic religions that gave people a sense of belonging died right alongside them. The individual citizen suddenly felt incredibly small, isolated, and lost in these massive, bureaucratic new empires.
So consequently, the entire purpose of philosophy shifted.
It had to.
Instead of trying to understand the fundamental physical nature of the universe or the ideal structure of a republic, philosophy essentially became a psychological survival guide for the anxious individual. People were desperate for peace of mind in a chaotic world they could no longer control.
And this desperation resulted in the two great Hellenistic philosophies that still resonate today.
Right. First, you have the Epicurean escape. Epicurus taught that the world is random, the gods don't care about you, and political ambition only brings pain. Therefore, you should withdraw from public life, live quietly in a garden with trusted friends, and seek simple, sustainable pleasures.
And then you have the Stoic compromise. The Stoics argue that you cannot control the massive, chaotic events of the world, but you have absolute control over your own emotional reaction to them. They advocated enduring the brutal hardships of life with rigid emotional control, accepting your fate, and doing your duty.
Hellenistic Greece profoundly changed the world. Dying politically, Greece bequeathed its advanced sciences, its sophisticated philosophies, its letters, and its exquisite arts to the conquering Romans.
And the Romans absorbed this culture completely and, in turn, transmitted it to the rest of Europe.
It's like looking at a dandelion blown by the wind.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, the original flower, the brilliant, concentrated energy of Periclean Athens, is dead and gone. But its seeds were scattered by Alexander and the Romans across the entire known world, taking deep root everywhere from the sands of Egypt to the rainy hills of Britain.
When we review the massive journey we have taken today, from the prehistoric, unfortified Bronze Age palaces of Minoan Crete to the quiet, highly specialized scholarly libraries of Hellenistic Alexandria, Will Durant's ultimate takeaway becomes clear. Greek history serves as an unparalleled laboratory of human civilization.
And when you look into that laboratory, you see our own modern struggles reflected with terrifying clarity. We see the corrosive, destabilizing effects of extreme wealth inequality in the lead-up to Solon's reforms.
We see the bitter, violent clash between the skeptical advancement of science and the desperate preservation of traditional faith in the trial of Socrates.
And we see the perpetual, exhausting tension between the human desire for absolute individual freedom and the stark necessity of maintaining social order.
The Greeks tested every form of government, pushed the boundaries of human thought, built breathtaking monuments, and then tore themselves apart from the inside.
As we conclude this in-depth exploration, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Observing the massive sweep of this history, Will Durant identified a chilling, overarching pattern in the life cycle of cultures.
He wrote that a nation is born Stoic and dies Epicurean.
It begins with immense discipline, shared sacrifice, and the rugged endurance needed to build something great. It ends when the citizens demand only comfort, retreat into private pleasures, and refuse to sacrifice for the common good.
So look closely at your own society today. Look at the culture around you. Are we in our discipline building phase, enduring hardship to secure the future, or are we in our comfortable Epicurean phase, prioritizing immediate personal pleasure and tuning out the chaos of the world?
And if we are in that latter Epicurean phase, who are the Romans currently waiting at our borders?
We invite you to explore related historical analyses in our history playlists. Notice what shifts throughout the centuries and what deeply human, profoundly troubling questions remain exactly the same.
To continue building this critical thinking practice, please visit Teachers Pay Teachers and our official website. You will find the links waiting for you in the written description below. There, we offer comprehensive classroom resources, deep discussion guides, and critical thinking worksheets built directly from Mindful Moments content. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.